글로벌 경기는 언제쯤 회복할 수 있을까요? 그리고 미국은 언제쯤 금리 인상에 나서고 중국은 무리 없이 연착륙을 할 수 있을까요? 앞으로 글로벌 경기에 향방을 쥐고 있는 변수들입니다. 오늘 더 리더에서는 글로벌 국제금융 전문가를 모시고 이 해답 찾아보겠습니다. 전 국제금융협회 회장을 지낸 찰스 달라라 파트너스 그룹 회장을 모시고 앞으로 글로벌 국제 경제에 대해서 살펴보고요. 그리고 또 우리나라에서 살필 수 있는 대응 전략까지 확인하는 시간 가져보도록 하겠습니다. Okay, so first of all, thank you for your time and thank you for coming here.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, thank you. And I heard that you had a lecture in Korea with the subject of global economy recovery, right?
Yes.
And many people say this economy is a stage on the recovery. And I wonder if you think the recovery is going on or not. What do you think?
Well, the recovery is underway, but it has been rather sluggish.
Yes.
And it has been more of an uphill struggle than I think many of us anticipated it would be.
What do you think? Why do you think so?
Well, I think, first of all, the global crisis of 2008 and 9 was very severe. And it initiated disruptions throughout the global economy. And it's taking a long time to heal, to regenerate the jobs, the competitiveness, and the momentum in the global economy today. One of the factors is that the authorities of the world initiated many important stimulus measures to support the global economy, but they, at the same time, initiated many demanding regulatory reforms on financial institutions.
Yes.
Now, some of these requirements are necessary. Some have arguably been overdone. The pendulum has swung a bit too far, and this has inhibited and limited the restoration of credit flow, particularly in Europe. And credit flow is so important to restoring economic growth.
Yes, right. So you mentioned that the recent recovery is a kind of really slow. So when will be the recovery should accelerate it?
January 12th, 2016.
2016?
I can't be very specific about it because I
Yes,
think
right.
it is gradually accelerating today. But it's going to continue, in my view, to be a rather sluggish recovery. Europe is still struggling with the after effects of its own sovereign debt crisis. Many emerging markets are now facing structural barriers to growth, which require long-term change. And I think that you see as well in the United States that we have had some difficulty in reestablishing the kind of economic momentum that we need. So I think we have to be a bit patient here. I think we also have to look not just at monetary policy, but at fiscal policy and structural policy if we're to support a sustained, strong global recovery.
So we should have to be patient for real recovery, right?
I'm afraid we will have to be somewhat patient.
Okay, so whole world is paying attention about the U.S. interest rate rise. So we were talking about this issue with a few questions. So first question is about the speed of rate rise. Some people say we should raise the interest rate fast for removing asset bubbles, but others say raise the interest rate slow for avoiding side effects such as shrinking economy. So which side do you support?
Well, the pace of interest rate increases,
Yes.
First, I think it's important to distinguish that the Federal Reserve can control the pace of interest rates only at the very short end of the market. The pace of interest rate increases in the 10-year market, in the medium and long-term market, is a function of market sentiment, not Fed policy. In terms of Fed policy, I would say a gradual approach is in order for markets to adjust. My concern is that with so much liquidity having been created for so long, and with so much movement by investors globally into higher risk assets, that the adjustment, not by the Fed, but the adjustment driven by market sentiment, may actually be more abrupt and could disrupt the global recovery.
So practically, when do you think U.S. will begin to raise their interest rates?
I think we will see the end of QE this year and a rise in Fed-driven, Fed-determined short-term rates no later than the middle of next year, most probably the second quarter. However, I think the most poignant question, the most important question for the recovery and for investors and for Korea is whether or not at some point the markets get ahead of the Fed. They did last year, as you recall, last summer, the 10-year rates in the U.S. moved up dramatically. And when that happens, it not only pulls up the base rates throughout the world, spreads rise. And so what today is seen as a low-risk asset on top of a low base rate could be a much more expensive asset, and credit spreads could widen considerably on certain emerging market assets and other assets, for example, high-yield debt in the U.S. markets.
So the interest rate rise problem is not only for U.S. but also in Korea too. If the rates rise, then the global investment money will be going out from the development country like Korea, right?
Well, there is some risk of that, although I think if you look at the developing countries that are most vulnerable to a rate rise, Korea is not among them.
Oh, really?
I would say that countries like Turkey, like Brazil, like South Africa, these are countries which have current account deficits. They also have higher inflation. They also have some degree of political uncertainty. In the case of Korea, you have a current account surplus, you have low inflation, you have a strong fiscal position. So even though Korea would be affected, because we're all part of one global financial system today, I think the adverse effects on Korea will be quite modest.
Okay,
quite
then
limited.
you mentioned that Turkey or South Africa will be affected about the rising rates, right?
Well, there is certainly a higher vulnerability in those economies than there is in Korea.
Yeah, then what would be the negative effect of a rate raising to those countries?
One effect, of course, could be an outflow of short-term capital. Each of these countries has a certain dependence, particularly Turkey and South Africa, on short-term capital. When that happens, it could require them to raise interest rates, to stabilize their exchange rates, and to stabilize inflationary pressures, which could be more difficult to sustain recoveries in their economies if they are rising rates to fight capital outflows, to fight inflationary pressures. And so I think this could create some serious complications. But these complications are not just for emerging markets. Investors in global markets need to be alert to the rising risks of rising rates. Because if a global investor has a large exposure in medium-term bond funds, this exposure could create serious problems for returns as interest rates rise.
And you said that Korea is safer than the other development country, right?
No country is completely safe in this environment, but I do think Korea is on much more solid footing today than many other emerging markets.
Then you think that the Korea is already prepared for Fed rate rising?
Better prepared, I think, than most. I mean, Korea needs to, of course, navigate its own path, very much aware at the same time of the global economic uncertainties. I think Korea has room now to stimulate its economy somewhat, but I also strongly support the government's push for structural reforms, for a new round of deregulation, for more creativity in the Korean economy, because these will sustain competitiveness. And by the way, I also support the push to increase the participation of women in the workforce here, which is unfortunately too low. I think that with these longer-term structural initiatives, Korea has scope for short-term stimulus, and Korea can ride through the storms of rising U.S. rates.
So I'm so happy to hear that. So thank you for your comment. And let's move on to the Eurozone issue. These days, the Eurozone economy looks like shrinking. The Germany and France's economy indicators are declining for a couple of months. And the biggest Portuguese bank, Banco Espírito Santo, was about to face default 2 weeks ago, right? So is there any possibility to Eurozone will be stuck in crisis again?
Well, I think that there is always a possibility, of course, that Europe could move back into the kind of crisis it had 2 or 3 years ago. But I think that possibility is relatively low. I think the more likely course of evolution for the European economy is a continued long period of stagnation. Europe needs to shake itself, almost to shock itself out of this stagnation through a number of important changes, both in the framework of Europe as well as in the short-term management of Europe. This requires a great deal of leadership. It requires a more unified Europe than we have seen. Since the crisis, Europe has been somewhat divided, and the measures taken to support the southern economies of Europe have been largely focused on fiscal austerity. This, unfortunately, has weakened these countries. Meanwhile, the needed emphasis on labor market, product market, and other structural reforms has not been sufficiently addressed, either in Southern Europe, or for that matter, even in important economies such as France. Europe needs a wave of deregulation and a wave of structural reform if it is to sustain its competitiveness into the middle of the 21st century.
Then we should be patient more to Europe than US or the other countries.
Well, I'm not sure the word is patience as much as just have, unfortunately, fairly low expectations for the European recovery. Europe needs as well to reconcile its future fiscal, monetary, and political structure. What does Europe really want to be? Does it want to be a federation of countries? Does it want to be just a common currency without a common fiscal framework? Until these long-term questions are answered, I'm afraid that Europe will continue to struggle to find the pace of recovery that they need.
Then I'm really curious about what will be the solution for the Eurozone economy. So what would be the essential solution for European fiscal or financial crisis?
I think that in the long run, Europe needs to complement its common currency with a common fiscal policy. They need to bite the bullet and have the courage to unify and integrate their fiscal policy. This is very difficult for them to do. But this could be done only as part of a broader vision of a more integrated political Europe. They must find their own way forward. In 1946, Winston Churchill, following the devastation of World War II, said that Europe should create its own form of a United States of Europe. That is not to say it should be a model based on the United States, but Europe needs to develop a sense of what its vision of a federated Europe would look like, and then put the building blocks in place. This could give investors confidence that a more integrated, a more coordinated, a more united Europe could be still a powerful force in the global economy.
Okay, then let's talk about the second biggest giant, China. So
your neighbor.
Your neighbor. Yeah, my neighbor. So the most interesting issue of China is their economy will making a soft landing. We hope that so. But the China has a big problem of excessive debt right now. So what's your view of the Chinese economy?
Well, you know, when I flew from San Francisco to Korea yesterday, the flight was bumpy at times, very seriously bumpy, but we did finally make a soft landing. And I think that we can expect some bumps along the way. I think that we can expect some unfortunate surprises coming out of the shadow banking system. We can expect some difficulties as China tries to reform its heavily state-owned economic system into a more dynamic, mixed model of state and private sector. But I do not expect that this is going to create a hard or abrupt landing. I think that China will continue to expand at a slower pace. But I think China also needs to really liberate and liberalize its financial and economic structures so that market forces can become a more dominant determinant of who survives and who doesn't in the Chinese corporate world. Otherwise, China will be relegated to investing in inefficient sectors which they can ill afford over the long term. China has many medium-term social issues of healthcare, of developing their agricultural sector, of providing a social safety net. And for China to move in this direction, they will need to create a framework whereby there are winners and losers in the domestic Chinese economy. This will take some further change. I think the Chinese leadership is up to the challenge, but we should not, in the global community, expect this to be a totally smooth ride.
Then one of the challenging of the fiscal reform, the Chinese government has been making an effort to make their yuan as an international currency. And the Korean-Chinese government agreed to making a direct yuan trading market weeks ago. And would you think the yuan will be successful an international currency like dollars or euros?
Well, I think they have to fully liberalize the convertibility of the Chinese yuan in order for this to happen. But I am rather encouraged, and I must say impressed, by the internationalization of their currency, which is taking place. And I think given the strong role China has as a leading trading country in the world,
yes,
it's natural, probably inevitable, that the Chinese currency, as the regulations around it fall away, and as there is greater freedom of movement of capital in and out of China, I think it's natural that the Chinese yuan will take an important role in global finance. I think the initiative between the Korean government and the Chinese government to create a yuan-won exchange,
yes,
is a very wise and welcome initiative. I think it will create trading efficiencies for both Korean and Chinese businessmen and further integrate these two important Northern Asian economies.
Then let's talk about Japan, another neighbor. Yeah. So Abenomics introduced their three arrows. It's the plan about the fiscal stimulus, monetary easing, and structural reforms. And they've shot all three arrows now. And how do you think about the success or failure of Abenomics?
Well, not to be too debating, but I'm not sure they have shot all three arrows. I think at least one era is still largely in the quiver, and that's the structural reform era. Yes, the Abe government has announced some broad plans on structural reform, but the detailed implementation is still not there.
Yet.
Not. I think that what they have done on quantitative easing is impressive. It has accomplished more than I thought it would. When I was in Japan late last year, I had a real feeling that Japan was getting its mojo back. It was regaining a sense of confidence, which frankly, Japan has lacked for some 20 plus years. But it will be a very difficult path because they have to stimulate the economy while bringing down a long-term fiscal debt, governmental debt, which is very high. And this is why they've had to increase the value-added tax, which has posed some short-term problems with domestic demand. I think they can manage that. I think the more difficult issue is Japan prepared really to implement a wide range of structural reforms which reach to the very heart of their economy and the very heart of their society. Liberalizing the role of women in the workforce, something that Korea is doing today, still poses a big challenge for Japan. Liberalizing immigration laws is probably a key to the medium-term success. Creating a much more open environment for small and medium-sized entrepreneurs. Deregulating important segments of the economy. These are all challenges which in opening up parts of their economy to fair trade. These are areas where the Abe government still has not fully delivered. And I would say that without that delivery, markets may well begin to lose some confidence in Abenomics over the next year or so. After all, this year, the growth is not looking so strong as it was last year.
Then what's the additional policies would be needed to boost Japanese economy?
Well, I just mentioned a number of those. I think liberalize and greatly adapt the role of women in the workforce. bring down the remaining barriers to trade, which in Japan are not just tariffs on the agricultural sector, but it's also non-tariff barriers.
But their trading deficit is wider and wider these days.
Yes, but they need a more competitive economy. It's not because they are liberalizing trade in order to reduce a trade surplus as it was 20 years ago. Today they need to liberalize it so that you can have a free flow of goods and services in and out of the Japanese economy. They need to deregulate the service sector. It is still highly regulated there. They need to create a much more favorable environment, I think, for innovation, and this will take a serious new push at deregulation at various levels of the Japanese economy. They still need to deregulate parts of the distribution system where you still have cost added to the Japanese consumer, which are not there in many more competitive economies. So Japan really needs to jolt its economic structure, not just the amount of money in the system, not just quantitative easing, if it wants to restore its position as one of the strongest economies in the world as it was 20 years ago.
So now let's move on to the Korean economy. So the Korean economy seems as recovering on several figures, but I cannot feel the recovery now. And the consumption and investment is not active, and unemployment problem is really serious. So how will be the Korean economy in the second half of this year or next year?
Well, the Korean economy continues to show an improving trend. 2012 was a difficult year for Korea, but we have seen improvements, and so was part of 2013. But we have seen a pickup in the pace of growth here in the Korean economy, and I think we will continue to see that. I do believe there is scope, should the government choose, to provide some additional stimulus. I believe that the government will need to consider ways to boost domestic demand. The government will need to, at the same time, monitor very carefully the mortgage market to ensure that this market doesn't become vulnerable to downside risk. I think the government's initiatives over creating a greater framework which welcomes and encourages creative technologies is an important step. I would also welcome a renewed emphasis by the government here on the creation of Seoul as a financial hub. There was an initiative some years ago, and in my view it was well framed, but it lost momentum partly because it's very difficult. When you talk about creating a financial hub, you're talking about everything from creating derivative markets to changing your immigration policies for foreign employers to come in and work here. You're talking about changing the educational opportunities available for foreign workers who want to come in and work here and ensure that their kids have high quality education, not just in Korean, but in other languages. So you're talking about wiping away layers of financial regulations. And this is difficult. But I think the government is on the right track with many of its initiatives today. I think that it will be important that Korean enterprise move in two directions. One is the large Korean corporations. We need to increasingly invest outside Korea to be global players, but there will need to be more space and more regulatory freedom for new entrants to compete in the Korean economy, and for the combination of new technology, academic and scientific work, and business development that has taken place in Silicon Valley and in the Boston area in the United States, in biotech and biopharma, in so many fields. This combination is not unique to America. A country like Korea can create a hotbed environment as well, but it will take a lot of work and a lot of deregulation.
Then what would be a most important factor to encourage foreign investors to Korea?
I think to ensure that all policies and all regulations are really fair to foreign investors, even-handed to foreign investors, and do not involve unnecessary red tape. We at the Partners Group are very positive about the medium-term outlook for investing in the Korean economy. We've already invested here, and we are going to be looking increasingly for additional investments opportunities in Korea. And I think that if you look out over the next 10 to 20 years, foreign investors can play an increasingly important role in job creation here in Korea, just as Korean firms will play an increasingly important role in the world economy at large.
And I want to talk about the Korean won's value now. Korean won is a strong other than the other countries' currencies now. And the Korean economy is based on the strong export, but the export company cannot because the strong won. So they say the Korean government and the Korean bank should lower their interest rate, but they don't. They don't now. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think we have to respect the independence of the central bank here. They need to decide what is the right course for Korea. I do think that there is a good case to be made, that there is some room within conventional monetary policy for Korea to continue to ease monetary policy. But the central bank will have to make that decision. They will have to decide if the time is right, if the circumstances are right. As far as the exchange rate is concerned, it is a rather strong exchange rate. I remember many times when it was quite the opposite. When I first started coming to Korea, it goes back to the early 80s, but in the mid 80s, the Korean won was very weak.
Yeah, right.
The surplus was 8.5% of GDP, 8.5%. And the Korean won was perhaps taking advantage of the adjustments in the other currencies with the yen and the Deutschmark having strengthened. Today, I understand the concern of Korean businessmen, but I don't think it poses a serious threat. Korea continues to do quite well in its exports. And Korean businesses have become quite lean and mean, I would say, in terms of understanding how to preserve market share and build their exports, even in this. And this has sharpened their competitive edge. So I understand the concerns, particularly at a time when the Japanese yen is somewhat weak. But I think that the keys to Korean business competitiveness in the future is not so much about exchange rate policy, it's about some of the other policies we're talking about.
Okay, so for the last, please tell us what would you be like to see in Korean economy in the future?
What would I like to see?
Yeah.
I would like to see a continued strengthening of the competitiveness of the Korean economy. I would like to see more vibrancy in the small and medium-sized business community here, more job creation coming out of that sector. I would like to see continued deregulation and transparency in the financial markets, because I think today that the push for global regulation is understandable for other banks, but I think here in Korea there is scope for a more competitive and more open financial system today. I would like to see more women sustaining their role in the workforce, not just when they're 24 and 25 and just out of school, because you have a highly educated female labor force, but sustaining. I would like to see job flexibility, new terms of engagement, so that females can play their family roles and fulfill those responsibilities and play. This could create untold dynamism in the Korean economy in the future, so that you will not only have female leaders at the helm of your government, but at the helm of businesses as well.
글로벌 경제 회복세가 감지되고 있지만 전 세계 금융기관들이 성장세를 낮추면서 우려 또한 커지고 있습니다. 하지만 위기는 기회라는 말이 있죠. 찰스 달라라 회장님의 말처럼 전 세계적으로 투자 유치에 나서면서 규제를 완화하는 것이 우리나라 경제에는 필요할 것으로 예상됩니다. 지금까지 함께해 주신 찰스 달라라 회장님 고맙습니다.